Welcome to Lesson 8 in the ASP.NET MVC UI add-on course. In this lesson, we're going to tackle the Create Tournaments page, where we actually create the tournaments. We already have that list of tournaments, and that's on the main page. But now we're going to get into that button where it says Create Tournament. We're going to wire that up. So the very first thing we need to do is let's create a blank controller. So we're going to right-click on Controllers and say Add Controller. We'll leave an empty for MVC5 controller empty, not the read-write actions. And we'll call this Tournaments. And there we go. So now we have somewhere to go when we are going to create a tournament. Now the interesting thing here is we don't actually need the index page because we don't have a list, which is typically what index is, that list of all the different tournaments. We really want the /create. So there's a few things we could do. One would be we could redirect the index page over to default, essentially, to the create page. The other thing we could do, and the thing I think that seems to make a little more sense, is that we will redirect to the home page, because the home page is where that list of tournaments resides. So what we'll do is, instead of returning this view, we're going to return a redirect to action. And we'll say the action name is the index action, and the controller name is the home controller. And we'll test that out now before we do anything else. So let's start this up. It should start in the home page. Yep, it does. So now we're here. Now we could do /tournaments here. The problem is it redirects to this page. So let's take it to a different page first and then do /tournaments. And that should take us right back to the home page. All right, so just saying /tournaments won't take you essentially anywhere. It just redirects back to this page since this is where the tournaments live. Now we are going to create a create. So tournaments /create. That create action will be there in order for us to essentially complete this video. Because that's really all we have to do is wire up this create tournament. So let's come back here. Let's actually go to the people controller and just grab these two right here. Because we know that we want the create action, that the people controller already has that. So we have the create action and we have the post. And this will be, let's first do our control dot for the models, but we want the tournament model. We want the control dot for our config, but actually we want to get rid of this as well because we're not yet ready to create a tournament. So we'll actually put to do here. There we go. So now we have this create page, or at least the action for it. Let's actually create the page. So add view, create, it's a create, and our model is the tournament model. We do want the script libraries. It's not a partial view. We use the same layout page, which is empty, therefore it's the _view start file, which is what we want. There we go. We can say create new tournament. And we'll have to make some modifications to this page. And in fact, we're actually going to have to change our model a little bit. So we'll get to that. But let's first look at what that should do. So let's come down to our Tracker UI, which is our WinForm app, and go to our Create Tournaments form. Now, this is the form we use in our user interface for WinForms because WinForms remembers information. It remembers that kind of like a state. If it was a web form, it'd be state. But it remembers information across hitting these buttons. So when we say create prize, it pops up a new box. We fill stuff in. It remembers that, it remembers what's on this form, and it takes the return from that form and puts it in this box. We can't really do the same kind of thing in a web form, and nor should we, because web forms are a totally different animal. And so we have to wrestle with how do we do it right for the web and do it best for our clients. And so I think we need to take a page out of the Create Team playbook that we did before, where we had that list of checkboxes. Now pattern it off of what this is, which it has both the list of select list item as well as a list of string for the value coming back out. So let's do the same thing. We'll go and find our tournament model, and we're going to grab all of this information. And we'll look at what we really need next. But for now, let's grab it all. Now, we don't need an ID like we didn't have here because we don't actually therefore that goes away as well. So this model has right now just 4 properties: tournament name and entry fee, which we have, and that's very easy to enter, a string and a decimal. But then we also have, we can actually make a modifier for that to say it's a currency type. We also though have this entered teams list and the prizes list. Now we need the output of those. We call it selected, and then the name. So select the team members here. So let's copy this idea and we'll paste it below each of these and then name them similarly. So selected MVC model. And since the names are very similar and we didn't have anything to do with those lists because it doesn't know how to deal with lists, we're fine as is. So before we go any further, let's go ahead and add the validation and the display names to our fields in the tournament MVC model. Let's start with tournament name. So I will paste these above it and we'll call it tournament name. That's spelled right. And we'll do control dot there. And that should bring in everything. We now have a required field called tournament name, a minimum length of 2 for the string length, a max 100, and that's required, which actually all sounds good. So I think we can leave that as is. Next is the entry fee, which it's not a string, so we don't want to do that. So let's take that out, and we'll call this entry fee with space. And now instead what we'll do is we'll do the data type. Data type dot currency, because that's the entry fee, therefore it'll format it as dollars and cents. Now, we don't do any validation on entered teams, selected entered teams, prizes, or selected prizes. So that's all we need to do for, well, we do need one more thing. Let's format this. Let's give it the display names that'll actually be valid display names. So do that, and we'll call this entered teams, and we'll call this one prizes. Okay, so now we have our essentially 4 properties, although we have 2 supporting properties, those list of strings. And now our model is complete. Now we need to start designing our create page to handle this new setup. And when I'm staring at this much HTML, I usually find the best way to kind of visualize what I want to do is to first run it so I can actually see what it really looks like. Otherwise, you're staring at it going, I'm just not even sure what I'm looking at here. And it looks like we actually have a bug here we need to fix. So we'll fix that in a minute. But right now we have this create tournament, new tournament, but then we have a tournament model and the horizontal rule. We can get rid of those 2. We might leave the horizontal rule for now. Let's try leaving it and see how we like it. I know it's different than the other forms, but we can go back through and make them all the same once we're kind of comfortable. And the way I develop UIs is I try and do my best job to get it right the first time. But as I go, if I see something, I'm not afraid to change it and make a tweak and go back and change the other things. Because sometimes after a little bit of use, you go, you know what? No, this is better. So I'll take this out. I'll leave the horizontal rule in. And I'm thinking what I'm going to do. Right now, this is grouped into 2 columns wide and 10 columns wide, this right here. And so all this space is used, but only for this little bit. And I want 3 columns worth of stuff. So I am actually going to crunch these up and have 1 column of, well, I'm going to call it 1 column, but 1 set of columns. It'll be, let's go 4 columns wide, we'll try. And so it'll be, this section, the first third, and it'll be for tournament name and entry fee. Then we'll have the next third, and that'll be for the teams. And the final third will be for prizes. And the create button, I'm not sure if we're going to center it or if we put it under one of the columns. We'll see. So let's get it in place and see how it looks, and then play around, tweak as we go. So let's close this out, fix this and this first. So let's take out tournament model and look up here and notice that I have a curly brace issue here. I have a closing curly brace, no opening curly brace. Now the easiest way to make sure I'm doing it right is to look at another create page and notice I've actually whacked off the beginning at and curly brace. So I can just copy this, close it out so I don't get confused, and then do that, paste it in. So that should solve that problem. And we haven't really tackled the viewbag.title yet. Like I said, we might change that just to say tournament tracker instead of having all these different versions, but I wanted to keep it so we can talk about it later. So we'll leave it alone for now. We'll come back to it later possibly. So we have this form, but I want to have 3 sets of a third of the page each columns. So the way I usually do this is I'm inside a form. I'm inside of, it says form horizontal, which may not be the best solution for us right now. If we look at Bootstrap, there's an option to do horizontal, which puts the label next to the field versus on top of the field. And I believe it's just form instead of form horizontal. Forms. Now see here they're stacked. And so it just says form. Whereas here I've got a div class equals form dash horizontal. So it looks like I can take that off and it should work. Now MVC does make things a little squirrely. So we might have to work with that. But let's try just taking off entirely this class. And then let's run that and see what results we get to see if it's what you want. And it's not. That's still that same awful look. So we're going to have to figure out a different way of applying the form inline, or taking off the form inline and making it a stacked form. So let's read through this and see if we can't see something else that might help. So let's start off with the basic form and just look at what we have over here. We have a form group, label, and then the editor. And here's what I'm thinking the problem is. We actually said, and it's not even going to be in the documentation because we did something different. Well, MVC did. We said, nope, call MD2 for the label, and then down here call MD10 for the editor. Therefore, we can't stack them because they're in 2 separate column groups. So we'll need to change that. But first, let's set up our 3 sections. So I'm going to say div class equals call dash MD dash 4, because 4 gives me 3 sections. I'll actually make 3 copies of this. And there are tools to make this a little easier, but I've not been using them currently for your demonstration. There's some tools that you can do to kind of shortcut creating divs and classes and all the rest. But that's really outside of scope of what I want to teach in this course. All right, so I have 3 classes here with a call of 4. Now I want to take this stuff here and put it inside the first one. So I'll take this stuff right here, not the submit button, just these first 2. The first one is our tournament name. The next one is our entry fee. So I'll Control X on those and paste them in here. And now let's see if we take off the call MD2 and we'll take off the call MD10 on these two and just see if maybe we can get these to stack the way we want. So that's reading the first third of the page, and hopefully they should be stacked on top of each other, label on top of text box. And they are, and that's perfect. Now if this is all squirrely, that's okay. We'll figure out how to make that work better once we get through the rest of the page. So the create button is still kind of down here. Not a big deal. Okay. So now what we need is we need to come down here and add our sections for our checkbox list. So let's go over to our create for the teams page. And like I said before, create and create makes it a little hard, but we'll at least know for right now where we're at, and then we'll just try and keep track. So let's copy a section right here, because this is, we'll actually take off these columns here, but this is the checkbox list that you want. So we'll copy this, we'll close it out so we only have the one create. We're going to paste it in. We're going to take off the columns. And yes, it's yelling at me about the model.team members. That's okay. We'll do a Control J here. And we'll say the first one is the entered teams. And we'll also paste it here because we're looping through the entered teams. So this is the label for it, and this is all the entered teams. And it loops through, and it's going to be selected entered teams. So that's our first checkbox list. Now let's copy all of this, and we'll paste it down below and do it again. Only this time, instead of entered teams, it's going to be for the prizes. And we'll paste that twice. And we'll also say selected prizes. So everything else stays the same. That should be pretty much all we need. Now we need to grab this form group here and cut this out and put it somewhere. This is the button, the submit button. We could put this in a new row if we wanted to, but let's just move it up underneath one of these entries. In fact, let's put it underneath the first column. So we'll put it here for now. Not my favorite place for it, but we'll see how it fits. We'll take out the columns here. We don't need them. And look down. I think everything else looks right. So now let's see how this actually runs. And the very first thing that happens is it blows up. Again, great for debugging because it'll help us think through what we're doing. In this case, it's saying null reference exception. It says there is no model. Model is null. Therefore, there's no entered teams on the model. Well, that's I won't say easy because you might not know what's happening here, but it's easier to figure out. It's especially easier if we look at what the Teams controller does. Let's go to Teams controller and look at the create, and notice we actually create a model and pass it in as input. We haven't done that with our tournament controller. So let's close this out. We'll close this out, and there's our tournament controller. So let's put it right next to it. So in our create, we need to simulate something pretty similar to this, where we get all the people, and then we populate a new model and pass that model in. In our case, we have a tournament, and it's called Tournament MVC Model. We'll do a control dot, add the using statement there, and we'll call this input equals new tournament MVC model. We'll pass that through just so we're sending it. But then we need to populate the input dot, and we have entered teams. We also have our list of prizes. So over here we did this whole select statement, but first we gathered the get all people. So in our teams controller, we have a get all right here. So let's grab this and paste it right here. So we have our list of all the teams, and now we also need a list of all the prizes. So we go to prizes, and we have here's how you get all the prizes. So we copy these two values and we paste them in our create method. Now we have a list of all the teams and all the prizes, and now we can follow this convention here to create a new select list item. So and really what we can do is actually take all of this and copy it so we have a model to go from. So we can say enter teams equals, and we'll say all teams dot select. For the text, we want to have the team name, and for the value, we want the ID. That's all there is to it. So we actually copy this and go to the end, and we paste it in. And instead of teams, now you want the prizes, and we'd say prizes. And instead of team name, we have our place name, and we'll use that for our prize, a selected prize. So we have all the information we need loaded in these two. The one thing I want to check, just to make sure we've done it, and yes, we have. We've initialized these lists. So that's the other thing we check to make sure of, especially these, it's important. These up here, the select list item lists, not as important because we're creating a new list and putting them in. So essentially we're overwriting the list. But down here, this has to be initialized. So best practice, initialize it always, and then you don't need to worry about it. So with that being said, I think we can push play and see it working, and we'll find out. And yes, Chrome didn't shut down properly. That warns me every time when I close the application from the C# side instead of the Chrome side. So that's a little weird, but it's okay. So now I have my teams, and I have my prizes, and I have my tournament name. So it's very easy to create a new tournament. Now, we don't actually have this wired up yet, but in theory, first of all, the validation should work. And now we should at least get to, let's move it aside. Using these things in patterns like this almost creates your own documentation, because you can go back to what you've already done and just say, let's copy this pattern. And the really nice thing is, this might have been a more complex page to do in MVC, except for the fact we've already done bits and pieces of it. So we don't have to figure out how to do a checkbox list. We've already got one. And we don't need to figure out how to create a new model and have that select list. We've already done it. We don't have to create that link statement over again to convert it over to a select list or select item list. We've already done that. And so really all this stuff becomes your documentation as long as you keep the same patterns. In this case, I'll actually copy this entire if statement. Now, normally, I wouldn't do this much copying. And I really push back on people that try and copy in code. But when you only have one monitor to work with, it's really hard to see the code and duplicate it. And so for the video's sake, I copy and paste. In my work environment, I would actually drag this tab off into a different window and then look at it while I rewrite it for the new model. So just so you know, there is a little bit of difference there. But I'm going to paste this in and then be very, very careful to go through and change everything. So for example, it says selected team members, and this should be model. It says selected team member. Is the tournament model dot tournament name, and that's right down here. Next, we need to grab that entry fee. So t dot entry fee equals model dot entry fee. After that, we have to do this conversion back. So we have t dot, instead of team members, we have our entered teams. And so it's the model selected teams, selected entered teams. We do a select and say it's a new, and this is a team model. And we have an ID, which is all we need. Remember, when we're saving, we only need those IDs, not all the information about a specific team. If we did need all that information, what we'd do is we'd actually do these two calls over again down here. And then for each one of these items, we'd loop through and find the matching item in the list. So that's what we do to change that, but we shouldn't need to do that. All right, so now I'll do the same thing again, only it would be prizes. And it's selected prizes. And it's going to be a prize model. And it's still the same thing with ID. Now, instead of create team, we have create tournament with the T, and we redirect back to the index action. Now, technically, the index action redirects us to home. So instead of doing a double redirect, what we're going to do instead is actually specify home. So that's a little more clean. It wouldn't be a big deal. It's not going to be a whole bunch of calls or anything, but I like clean. So let's do that. And again, if the model state is not valid, we go back to that same create page. We are doing the validate anti-forgery, and we are checking the model state's validity. So in theory, that should be everything we need. So before we go any further, let's actually wire up the button on our main page. So there's a button right here, and it's actually a anchor tag, but it looks like a button, and it says create a tournament. Now, we don't want that. We actually want to send it to a specific controller. Now, the way to change this to call a controller is not to use a straight up anchor tag. Instead, what we'll do is we'll create a new entry here. So we'll put our P in. I'm going to keep this here as a copy just so we know what we want to replicate, like this class stuff right here we want to replicate. But now I'm going to use some razor syntax and say at html.actionLink. And this creates an anchor tag. But the anchor tag that points to a specific action and controller. That way we don't have to know the path of our web server or figure that out or anything else like that. It just knows from my base URL, go to /home/index or whatever you specify. So we'll first start with the name of it, the text link. And this is create a tournament. And then we give it the action name, and it's create. And the next thing we give it is the controller name, tournaments. Now, before we go any further, I'm not sure I've mentioned yet that the name of the controller is tournaments, not tournaments controller. And what MVC does is it says, okay, if you have a tournaments controller, it's named tournaments, so therefore we'll create a folder down here in views called tournaments. So it links everything together based upon that name, not the descriptor. So the name is tournaments, the descriptor is it's a controller. So in this case, the controller is implied because that's what we're calling it the controller. And you shouldn't specify tournaments controller, just tournaments. All right. So that's our controller, our action, and the name of our link, but we need to add all these classes right here. So we say new anonymous object. And before we go any further, let's close out this paren as well. So there we go. But now inside the anonymous object, I can say at class. Now the reason I say at and then class is because we can't use the keyword class. Class is a C# keyword, but it's also an indicator of an HTML item called class. So you have, one step on the other's toes when the two are mixed together, like in this razor syntaxed page. Because we have HTML and then we have razor. And so mixing these two together can cause problems if we have a naming conflict. When I use the at class, it knows what to do. In this case, it knows that it means the HTML class. So at class, and I say equals, and then put a set of double quotes. Inside that, I will just paste all of these classes. There we go. Now I don't need this anymore. And in theory, that button should look exactly the same. It's just that it should be a action link that takes us to the right controller. Let's find out. So let's launch this up and see if, in fact, all that work does actually work. And that's one up the information about what should be inside of this method. So this should be our text link. That's what's bolded. Yep. And then we have, I clicked it. So we have our action name. Yep. Then our route values. And that's not right. So let's do our down arrow to look at the next one. It's not our route values again. Nope. This is the one we want. So text link, action name, controller name, but then it says route values and then HTML attributes. So we have to actually include our route values here. So let's do that. And you may say, just so we have a couple. All right, we hit create. Now let's look at our model and let's zoom in here. And notice we have no entered teams and no prizes, but we have 7 selected entered teams and 2 selected prizes, as well as an entry fee of 15 and a tournament name that is correct as well. So now it should be that everything else works as expected. But let's find out for sure by actually creating this tournament. We hit play. And now it's saying, no, it's not working the way you expected. And it's come back and saying that the model is null. Now we've had this problem before. When we threw an error, it sent us back to the page, but that model was null, so we had a problem. And that's right here in the catch. So I'm guessing we actually caught an error. So let's do this. Let's stop it. Let's actually catch the error. And then let's put a breakpoint on the return view. Now we'll actually see what this variable has in it when it hits that error. So let's launch this again. We'll say, yes, that's okay. We'll hit create tournament. We'll say MVC tournament, $15 entry fee. We'll select all 7 of our teams. And we'll say first and second place. We hit create, and we have an exception. And it says sequence contains no elements. Now, where that happens, we have to trace down, but let's start by looking at our model state first. It's true. I mean, it's valid. Selected entered teams is 7. That's okay. Let's look at our tournament model that we've been creating. And it doesn't say anything at all. I can't even get to it right now. So let's start up at the top here and work our way down this exception tree. So I'm going to start this over again. And yes, I know that Chrome didn't start well, or didn't shut down right. We hit Create Tournament. We fill in all the same information as before. And that's one of those important things too. Don't start changing your information. Always do the same thing. If you do, it makes debugging a little clearer because the same thing happens the same way every time. So I hit Create, and the tournament name looks right. So if I hit Step Into, I don't want to continue to be notified about this. So what this is right here is it's a warning that says you're stepping into and automatically step over a property or operator. It's just saying there's certain things you can't actually step through. But don't worry, we'll keep stepping in wherever you can. Do you want to keep being warned about this? No. So the tournament name is now MVC Tournaments. The entry fee looks good, and in fact it goes through. Now, we have our entered teams. If we step over this instead of stepping through each level, we now have 7 entered teams, and they all work. Now, prizes, we have 2 selected prizes. We step over that. We have 2 selected prizes. Now we go to create our tournament. Let's step into this. First, we get our connection string. In fact, we can step over that whole line. Let's start with the save tournament. Tournament name, entry fee, ID. Let's execute the SP tournaments _ insert. That seemed to have worked. And in fact, the ID came back as 11. So that worked. Now let's go to prizes. And it should loop through every prize and insert it. And it seems to be working there as well. So it's linking those prizes to the tournament. Next, the tournament entries. Looping through the for each, we come back, and now we save the tournament rounds. Well, guess what? We haven't touched the tournament rounds yet. So, therefore, we have nothing in this model for tournament rounds. Rounds is 0. So for each round, well, there are no rounds. So that's a problem. And that's probably where our error is. We do know that we've gotten to this point. We have an issue here, not yet the exception, but an issue. So let's go ahead and fix that issue and see if maybe that resolves our overall exception. So I'm actually going to hit stop here instead of continuing to run. And we're going to look back at our reference form. So over here on Create Tournaments form, let's look at the code. Let's actually look at the actual page first. Double click on Create Tournament. We can close out it now, because that takes us right to here with our Create Tournament button click. And so the first thing it does is make sure that the fee is acceptable. Well, We don't need to do that. We've already done that with our validation. Then it creates a tournament model. We've done that. Entry name and fee, cool. Or a tournament name and fee, that's cool. Prizes, entered teams, great. Right there. We didn't wire up our matchups. So therefore, we can't yet call this because we have not yet created our rounds. So we can actually just copy this code right here, come back over to our team controller. Before we create tournament, we say create the rounds. And that should actually be T, not TM. I'm assuming. Let's make sure by looking back at it and seeing what that actually does. So down here, we have our tournament model called TM. We call it T. So that's the reason why I said TM, not T. Now note, before I go away, after we create the tournament, we also have the alert users to new round. So that's something we haven't done either. So let's do that as well. Let's alert the users to the new round by copying that. Let's actually look at what that does before we do anything else. So that goes through and it checks to see if it's the current round, and it fires alert. And the alert actually sends an email out, and it also might send a SMS text message. So that's where all that happens, and it happens after we create the tournament, as long as it was successful. And since we're going to try catch, that's perfect. So now, and again, it's T, not TM. Now we've got it wired up the same way as our reference form, which we know works. So in theory, we should be good to go. So let's start this again. I'll keep my breakpoint on that exception just in case we were to throw it again. We didn't really see where that exception happened, but we do know we were not doing a couple things we should have. So let's call this, let's go back to the home page for a minute. I want to show you something. We do have MVC tournament here. So let's call it something different, just so we have, let's call it better MVC tournament. That way we know that this is the new one. I'll select all 7 teams and those 2 places. I'll hit create. I wait for it, and it should be that I now have better MVC tournament in the list. We've actually created our tournament. And that's it. We've wired up the create tournament page. It works the same way as the create tournament page in our WinForms app. It's just that it does things a little differently. But we've wired everything up the way it should be wired. It's working. This button works. If, for whatever reason, a person were to say, well, I actually want to go to /tournaments, it takes them right back to the home page without an issue. And If they try and create a tournament without information, it goes, no, you need to fill the information right. If for whatever reason they hit create now with nothing selected, it's going to bring them right back here and say, no, you can't do that. This return to list, we need to fix because we don't actually, well, we don't need to fix it because the return to list actually sends you back to the home page, which technically is the list. And since all those pages had that return to list, I think it makes sense just to keep it the way it was. So actually a pretty simple video as far as we've done all this before. It's just putting it together in new and interesting ways. And that's what programming is all about. You learn a way of putting something together and then you use it in multiple different ways over your career. So I hope you learned a lot. In the next video, we're going to wire up the tournament viewer, which actually will activate all of these links and allow us to actually run a tournament. And that'll be the last major step in this application. Now, we still have deployment, and we'll get into that, but stay tuned for lesson 9 where I wire these up.